The blizzard hit 3 days before Christmas in 1881, and by the time the snow stopped falling, Josephine Anders had already been missing for 24 hours in the frozen wilderness surrounding Wyatt, Missouri. Frank Winters stood on the porch of the general store, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing so hard his knuckles turned white beneath his work-worn skin. He was 26 years old, a cattle rancher who had spent the last 8 years building his spread from nothing, and in all that time, he had never felt fear like this. The kind that settled deep in your bones and refused to let go. Josephine was out there somewhere in those endless white hills, and every minute that passed meant her chances grew slimmer. "Frank, you cannot go back out there tonight," Sheriff Coleman said from behind him, his voice heavy with concern. "You have been searching for near on 18 hours straight. You will freeze to death yourself." Frank turned to face the older man, his jaw set with determination. "She is alive, Sheriff. I know she is, and I will not stop looking until I find her." The story had started simple enough. Josephine Anders had arrived in Wyatt 6 months prior, a young woman of 22 with striking auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to hold entire forests within them. She had come from St. Louis to teach at the new schoolhouse, replacing Mrs. Henderson, who had retired after 30 years of service. Frank had first seen her on a warm July afternoon when she stepped off the stagecoach, her traveling dress dusty from the long journey, a worn leather satchel clutched in her hands. He had been in town picking up supplies, loading bags of grain into his wagon when the coach arrived. Something made him look up at that exact moment, and their eyes met across the dusty main street. She had smiled, just a small curve of her lips, but it had struck him like lightning. In that instant, Frank Winters knew his bachelor days were numbered. Over the following months, he found reasons to come to town more often than necessary. He would time his visits to coincide with the end of the school day, watching from a respectful distance as Josephine led her students in their lessons or supervised their play during recess. She had a way with the children that made his heart ache, patient and kind, but firm when needed. The little ones adored her. Their first real conversation happened in September at the church social. Frank had worked up the courage to approach her where she stood by the dessert table, her hands clasped in front of her modest blue dress. "Miss Anders," he had said, his voice coming out rougher than intended, "I am Frank Winters. I own the cattle ranch about 5 miles north of town." She had turned to him with that same gentle smile, and up close he could see the dusting of freckles across her nose. "Mr. Winters, I have heard your name mentioned. You donate beef to the school for our winter provisions." "It is nothing," he had replied, feeling heat rise to his face. "The children need to eat." "It is not nothing," Josephine had said softly. "It is kind. There is not enough kindness in this world." They had talked for over an hour that night, standing apart from the other townspeople, sharing stories about their lives. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a bookkeeper who had died when she was 16, leaving her and her mother to make their own way. Her mother had passed 2 years ago from pneumonia, and Josephine had decided she needed a fresh start, somewhere she could make a real difference. Frank had shared his own history, orphaned, young, and taken in by a rancher named Samuel Crawford, who taught him everything about cattle and horses and living off the land. When Samuel died, he had left Frank enough money to buy his own small spread, and Frank had been building it up ever since. From that night forward, they were inseparable whenever Frank came to town. He would take her for rides in his wagon, showing her the beautiful countryside around Wyatt. They would have picnics by the creek that ran through his property, and she would read to him from the books she loved, her voice melodic and soothing. Frank had never been much for reading himself, but he could listen to Josephine read for hours. By November, Frank knew he was going to marry her. He had bought a ring from the jeweler in the next town over, a simple gold band with a small emerald that reminded him of her eyes. He had been planning to propose on Christmas Eve, had already built a new room onto his ranch house in preparation for their future together. But then the blizzard came. Josephine had been visiting the Hendricks family, who lived in a remote cabin about 8 miles from town. Little Sarah Hendricks had been sick with fever, and Josephine had promised to bring her lessons so she would not fall behind the other students. She had left on the morning of December 20th on horseback, assuring everyone she would return before dark. But the storm had rolled in with shocking speed, the sky turning from clear blue to ominous gray in less than an hour. By noon, snow was falling so thick you could not see 5 feet in front of your face. Frank had been in town when it hit, and his first thought had been of Josephine. He had ridden out immediately despite the conditions, making his way toward the Hendricks place. The snow had been coming down so hard that the usual landmarks disappeared, everything becoming a blur of white. He had pushed forward for hours, his horse struggling through drifts that grew deeper with every passing minute. When he finally reached the Hendricks cabin, his heart had nearly stopped. Marcus Hendricks met him at the door, confusion on his weathered face. "Frank, what are you doing out in this weather?" "Josephine," Frank had gasped, ice coating his beard. "Is she here?" "Miss Anders?" "No, son, she was never here today. We have been snowed in since morning." The bottom had dropped out of Frank's world. If Josephine had never made it to the Hendricks place, that meant she was somewhere between town and here, lost in the worst blizzard to hit Missouri in a decade. He had ridden back immediately, searching every inch of ground he could cover, calling her name until his voice went hoarse. But the storm was too fierce, visibility too poor. After nearly falling into a ravine he could not see, Frank had been forced to return to town before he got himself killed. That had been yesterday. The storm had continued through the night and into the next day before finally breaking that afternoon. The moment the snow stopped, Frank had gathered a search party. Sheriff Coleman, Doc Morrison, and 5 other men from town had ridden out with him, splitting up to cover more ground. They had searched until darkness made it impossible to continue, finding no trace of Josephine or her horse. Now they wanted him to stop, to rest, to wait until morning, but Frank could not stop. Would not stop. "I am going back out," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You can come with me or stay here, but I'm not leaving her out there another night." "Frank, be reasonable," Doc Morrison interjected. "It is pitch black. You will not be able to see anything. You will ride right past her even if she is there." "Then I will go on foot," Frank replied. "I will carry a lantern, but I'm going." Sheriff Coleman exchanged a look with the doctor, then sighed heavily. "Let me get my horse. I will not let you go alone." They rode out into the frozen night, 2 lanterns casting weak pools of light across the snow-covered landscape. The temperature had dropped viciously after the storm, and Frank could feel the cold seeping through his heavy coat. If Josephine was still alive out here, she would be suffering terribly. The thought made him push harder, guiding his horse along the route she would have taken toward the Hendricks place. He called her name every few minutes, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Hours passed. The moon rose high above them, turning the snow into an endless field of silver. Still they found nothing. "Frank," the sheriff said quietly around midnight, "we should head back. Get some rest and start fresh at dawn with more men." "No." Frank's response was immediate and firm. "Every hour matters. She could be injured, unable to move. If we leave now, she might not make it through the night. And if you collapse from exhaustion, you will not be any good to her either," Coleman argued. "Think, son. You have been going for near on 40 hours straight. Your body has limits." Frank knew the sheriff was right, but the thought of turning back made him physically ill. Still, he was swaying in his saddle, his vision blurring at the edges. With enormous reluctance, he finally nodded. They made their way back to town, and Frank allowed himself 2 hours of restless sleep on a cot in the sheriff's office, before rising again while it was still dark. He drank the bitter coffee Mrs. Coleman brought him, ate the biscuits she insisted he needed for strength, and was back on his horse before the first light of dawn touched the horizon. This time more than a dozen men joined the search. They spread out in a wide line, covering every possible route Josephine might have taken. Frank took the center position, his eyes scanning every drift, every tree, every shadow that might be her. The day passed in a blur of white and cold. They found her horse around noon, frozen solid in a gully about 4 miles from town. The sight of it made Frank's heart clench, but he forced himself to take it as a good sign. If her horse had made it this far, Josephine might have too. She would have been on foot from here, Sheriff Coleman observed, examining the area around the dead animal. Probably got thrown when the horse lost its footing in the storm. Frank was already moving, searching the ground for any sign of footprints. The snow had drifted and blown, covering most traces, but he found what looked like a disturbed area leading east, away from the trail. There, he said, pointing. She went that way. They followed the faint traces, Frank's heart pounding harder with each step. The trail led toward a rocky area dotted with caves and overhangs. It was rough country, dangerous in good weather, and potentially deadly in a blizzard. As they climbed higher into the rocks, Frank spotted something that made him pull his horse to an abrupt halt. A scrap of dark blue fabric caught on a thorny bush fluttering in the wind. He recognized it immediately. Josephine had been wearing her dark blue traveling cloak the day she left. "She came through here," he said, his voice tight with emotion. He dismounted and began moving on foot, calling her name. "Josephine, Josephine, can you hear me?" The only answer was the wind whistling through the rocks. They searched the area thoroughly, checking every cave and crevice. Most were empty, some showed signs of animal habitation, but none contained any trace of the missing school teacher. As the sun began to set on the second day of searching, Frank refused to leave the rocky area. Something in his gut told him she was close. He sent the other men back to town, promising he would return by morning, but he had no intention of keeping that promise. He built a small fire in one of the larger caves and settled in for the night, his rifle across his lap in case of wolves or mountain lions. Every few hours he would venture out into the darkness, lantern in hand, calling Josephine's name until his throat was raw. The third day dawned clear and brutally cold. Frank had maybe slept an hour total, his body running on sheer determination and fear. He continued his search of the rocky terrain, moving in ever-widening circles from where he had found the scrap of cloth. Around mid-morning he heard voices calling his name. The search party had returned, this time with nearly 20 men. Frank was grateful for their help, but frustrated by how much time they spent trying to convince him to eat, to rest, to think rationally. "I am thinking rationally," he insisted. "She is alive. I know it. I can feel it." Doc Morrison pulled him aside, speaking in the gentle tone one might use with someone losing their grip on reality. "Frank, it has been 3 days. 3 days in this cold, without shelter, without food or water. Even if she found some protection from the storm, the odds of survival are very slim. You need to prepare yourself." "No," Frank said flatly. "I will not prepare myself for her death, not while there is still a chance." He pulled away from the doctor and continued searching, ignoring the pitying looks from the other men. Let them think he was delusional. Let them think grief had made him irrational. He knew Josephine was alive. He had to believe it because the alternative was unthinkable. The fourth day brought fresh snow, light but enough to cover any remaining traces. The search party had dwindled to just 5 men besides Frank. He could see the resignation in their faces, the way they were going through the motions more to support him than out of any real hope. On the 5th day, Sheriff Coleman had to physically restrain Frank from going back out. "You are going to kill yourself, Laura," the sheriff said, his hands gripping Frank's shoulders. "Look at yourself, son. You can barely stand. When did you last eat? When did you last sleep for more than an hour?" "Let go of me," Frank said, his voice dangerous and low. "I have to find her." "Frank, she is gone." The words came from Mayor Peterson, who had joined them in the sheriff's office. "I know this is hard to accept, but Miss Anders is gone. We will keep searching, but you need to rest. You need to take care of yourself." Frank shook off the sheriff's hands and walked to the door. "If you will not help me, I will search alone." And he did. For the next 2 days, Frank searched alone, covering the same ground over and over, checking places he had already checked a dozen times. His horse had gone lame, so he went on foot, trudging through the snow with single-minded determination. People in town began to whisper that the search had driven him mad, that grief had broken something in Frank Winters's mind. He ignored them all. On the seventh day, he woke before dawn in the cave where he had been sleeping, his body aching and his mind foggy with exhaustion. He had run out of food 2 days ago and his water was nearly gone. He knew he should return to town, resupply, maybe rest for a day, but he could not shake the feeling that today was important, that if he gave up now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He set out at first light, moving deeper into the rocky terrain than he had gone before. The area was treacherous, full of hidden ravines and unstable ground. Most of the search party had avoided this section, deeming it too dangerous. But if Josephine had been disoriented in the storm, she might have stumbled into this area without realizing the danger. Frank moved carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight down. He called her name periodically, though his voice was barely more than a hoarse whisper now. Around midday, he spotted something that made his heart leap. A footprint, small and distinct, preserved in a patch of snow protected from the wind by an overhang. It was old, partially filled in, but definitely a footprint. Frank followed the direction it pointed, moving faster now despite his exhaustion. More prints appeared, erratic and wandering, showing someone who had been lost and confused. They led him to a narrow passage between two large rock formations, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He pushed through the gap and found himself in a small, sheltered depression, almost completely hidden from view. And there, huddled against the far wall beneath a shallow overhang, was a dark blue shape dusted with snow. Josephine! Her name tore from his throat as he stumbled forward, falling to his knees beside her still form. She was curled into a tight ball, her cloak wrapped around her, and for one terrible moment Frank thought he was too late. Then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest, the slight puff of breath visible in the freezing air. She was alive. His hands shook as he touched her face, brushing away the snow that had accumulated on her hair and clothes. Her skin was ice cold, her lips tinged blue, but she was breathing. "Josephine," he said again, more softly this time. "Josephine, can you hear me? It is Frank. I am here. I found you." Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. She made a small sound, barely audible, and tried to pull away from his touch. No, it is all right," Frank soothed, carefully gathering her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he realized with horror that she had probably not eaten since before the storm hit. 7 days without food, in freezing temperatures. How she had survived was nothing short of miraculous. He needed to get her warm immediately. Carrying her as gently as possible, he made his way back through the narrow passage and began the difficult journey to the cave where he had been camping. It was nearly a mile away, and every step was agony with his exhausted body, but he forced himself to keep moving. When he finally reached the cave, he laid Josephine down near where he would build the fire and quickly gathered wood, getting a blaze going as fast as his numb fingers would allow. Once the flames were crackling, he turned his attention back to her. Her clothes were damp from the snow, which was dangerous. He needed to get her out of them and into something dry. He had an extra blanket and his spare shirt in his pack. Working as carefully and respectfully as possible, keeping his eyes averted, he removed her wet cloak and dress, replacing them with his dry shirt and wrapping her in both blankets. Then he pulled her close to the fire and began rubbing her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation. Her fingers were worryingly pale, and he feared frostbite. As he worked, he talked to her, his voice steady and reassuring. "You are safe now, Josephine. I have got you. I am so sorry it took me so long to find you. I looked every day, every hour. I never stopped. I would never stop looking for you." After what felt like hours, her eyelids finally fluttered open. Her green eyes were unfocused at first, confusion and fear written across her delicate features. Then they found his face, and something like recognition flickered there. "Frank?" Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and dry. "Yes, it is me." He had to fight to keep his own voice steady. "I found you. You're going to be all right now." "Cold?" she whispered. "So cold." I know. I am working on warming you up. Here, try to drink a little water. He held his canteen to her lips, letting her take tiny sips. Too much at once would make her sick, but she needed fluids desperately. As the warmth from the fire began to seep into her, Josephine started to tremble, her entire body shaking violently. Frank knew this was actually a good sign, her body trying to generate heat, but it was difficult to watch. He pulled her against his chest, sharing his body warmth, keeping the blankets tucked tight around her. "What happened?" he asked gently. "Do you remember?" Josephine was quiet for a long moment, her shaking gradually subsiding. When she finally spoke, her voice was weak but clearer. "The storm came so fast. I was about halfway to the Hendricks place when it hit. I tried to keep going, but I could not see anything. My horse got spooked by thunder and threw me. I tried to catch him, but he ran off." She paused, taking another sip of water. "I knew I needed to find shelter, so I started walking. I thought I was going back toward town, but I must have gotten turned around. Everything looked the same. White everywhere. I walked for hours, and then I found that little hollow in the rocks. I crawled in there to wait out the storm." "You have been there this whole time?" Frank asked, amazed. Josephine nodded weakly. "I was too weak to move after the first few days. No food, barely any water from eating snow. I just kept sleeping, hoping someone would find me, hoping you would find me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I knew you would look for me, Frank. I knew you would not give up." The absolute trust in her voice broke something open in Frank's chest. He tightened his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. "I will always find you," he said fiercely. "No matter what, I will always come for you." They stayed in the cave for several hours, Frank slowly getting food into Josephine. Just small bites of jerky and hardtack that he softened in water first. As her strength began to return, she talked more, telling him about the long, terrifying days alone in the rocks. "I thought about you constantly," she admitted, her head resting against his shoulder, "about all the things I never got to say to you, all the moments we would never have." Frank pulled back slightly to look at her face. "What things did you want to say?" Josephine met his eyes, and despite her weakness, he could see the depth of emotion there. "That I love you. That I have loved you since that first conversation at the church social. Maybe even since that first moment when I stepped off the stagecoach and saw you watching me." Frank's breath caught in his throat. "Josephine, I know it is improper for a woman to speak so boldly," she continued, a faint blush coloring her pale cheeks. "But I thought I was going to die out here. And the thing I regretted most was never telling you the truth. I love you, Frank Winters. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you look at me like I am the most precious thing in the world." Frank cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. "You are the most precious thing in my world, and I love you too. I have loved you from the beginning. I was going to ask you to marry me on Christmas Eve. I have a ring and everything." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. "You do?" "I do. I built a new room on my house for us, for our future. I had it all planned out." He smiled, though his own eyes were wet. "This was not how I imagined this conversation going, but I am not going to waste another moment. Josephine Anders, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, and let me spend the rest of my life loving you?" "Yes," she whispered, her smile radiant despite her weakened state. "Yes, Frank. Nothing would make me happier." He kissed her then, gently because she was still so fragile, pouring 7 days of fear and relief and love into that single kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time, but Frank knew they were not out of danger yet. Josephine needed proper medical care, warm food, and rest. As much as he wanted to stay in this bubble with her, holding her and never letting go, he needed to get her back to town. "Do you think you can ride?" he asked. "My horse is not far from here. I can hold you in front of me, keep you steady." Josephine nodded. "I can try." Getting her dressed again in her now dry clothes was a challenge, but they managed it together. Frank kept the blankets wrapped around her for extra warmth and carefully lifted her into his arms. She weighed so little that it frightened him, but she was alive and she loved him, and they were going to have a future together. He carried her to where he had left his horse and mounted up, settling her carefully in front of him. She leaned back against his chest, and he wrapped one arm securely around her waist while holding the reins with the other. The ride back to town took several hours. The sun was setting by the time they reached the outskirts of Wyatt, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. As they rode down the main street, people began emerging from buildings, their faces showing shock and disbelief. "Frank found her!" someone shouted. "He found Miss Anders!" Within moments, they were surrounded by townspeople, everyone talking at once, asking questions, expressing relief and amazement. Sheriff Coleman pushed through the crowd, his weathered face breaking into a broad smile. "I will be damned," he said. "You actually did it, son. You found her." "I told you I would not give up," Frank replied. "Now please, someone get Doc Morrison. She needs medical attention." The doctor was already hurrying toward them, his medical bag in hand. "Bring her to my office, quickly now." Frank carried Josephine into the small building that served as the doctor's office and clinic, laying her gently on the examination table. He started to step back, but her hand shot out and grabbed his. "Do not leave," she said, fear in her eyes. "I am right here," Frank assured her, lacing his fingers through hers. "I am not going anywhere." Doc Morrison examined Josephine thoroughly, his expression growing more relieved as he worked. Finally, he stepped back with a small smile. "It is remarkable," he said. "Given what she has been through, her condition is better than I could have hoped. She is severely dehydrated and malnourished, and she has some minor frostbite on her fingers and toes, but nothing that will not heal with proper care. Miss Anders, you are an exceptionally lucky woman." "Not lucky," Josephine said softly, her eyes on Frank. "Blessed. I had someone who loved me enough to never stop searching." The doctor's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "Yes, well, you need rest, plenty of fluids, and good food. I want to keep you here for observation tonight, but if all goes well, you should be able to go home tomorrow." "She will be staying at my ranch," Frank said firmly, "where I can take care of her properly." Doc Morrison raised an eyebrow. "That would be highly improper, Frank, unless—" "We are engaged," Josephine said, holding up her left hand even though it bore no ring yet. "Frank asked me to marry him, and I said yes." The news spread through town like wildfire. By the next morning, when Frank carried Josephine out of the doctor's office and helped her into his wagon, it seemed like the entire population of Wyatt had turned out to see them off. Women brought baskets of food for Josephine's recovery. Men clapped Frank on the back and congratulated him. The children from the school presented Josephine with handmade cards welcoming her back. Mrs. Coleman approached with a knowing smile and pressed something into Frank's hand. "You will be needing this," she said quietly. Frank looked down to find the engagement ring he had bought, the one he had left in his room at the boarding house before going out to search for Josephine. The landlady must have found it and given it to the sheriff's wife for safekeeping. "Thank you," he said gratefully. Once they were clear of town, Frank stopped the wagon and turned to Josephine. She looked so much better already, color returning to her cheeks, though she was still far too thin. "I should have done this properly the first time," he said, taking her hand. "Josephine Anders, you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You survived a week alone in a blizzard through sheer will and courage. You fill my days with joy and my heart with love. I promise to cherish you, protect you, and love you for all the days of my life. Will you do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife?" Josephine's eyes filled with happy tears as Frank slipped the ring onto her finger. The emerald caught the sunlight, sparkling like her eyes. "I will," she said. "Today, tomorrow, always. I will be yours, Frank Winters." They kissed in the wagon on the snow-covered road, and it felt like a new beginning. Like the nightmare of the past week was finally behind them, and their real life together was just beginning. The ranch house was warm and welcoming when they arrived. Frank had asked his ranch hand Tom to make sure the fires were lit and everything was ready. He carried Josephine over the threshold even though they were not married yet, making her laugh. "Getting ahead of ourselves, are we not?" she teased. "Just practicing," Frank replied with a grin. Over the next few weeks, Frank devoted himself entirely to Josephine's recovery. He cooked for her, simple but nourishing meals. He read to her from her beloved books when she was too tired to read herself. He rubbed salve into her frost-bitten fingers and toes every day, and slowly but surely, she healed. As Christmas approached, they decided to have a small ceremony. Neither of them wanted a big wedding. They just wanted to be married, to start their life together without further delay. On Christmas Eve, exactly when Frank had originally planned to propose, they stood before the minister in the small Wyatt church. Josephine wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Coleman had helped her make. Frank wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed for once. The entire town attended, packing the small building to capacity. As Frank looked into Josephine's eyes and spoke his vows, he thought about how close he had come to losing her, how easily this moment might never have happened. But he had not given up. He had searched for 7 days through bitter cold and snow, and he had found her. He had brought her home. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said with a warm smile of Frank. "You may kiss your bride." And he did, pouring all his love and relief and joy into that kiss while the congregation erupted in applause. The wedding celebration lasted well into the night. There was music and dancing and more food than Frank had seen in one place. Josephine was radiant, smiling and laughing, looking nothing like the half-frozen woman he had found in the rocks just 3 weeks earlier. As the evening wound down and they prepared to head back to the ranch, now truly their home together, Josephine pulled Frank aside. "Thank you," she said softly, "for never giving up on me, for believing I was alive when everyone else had given up hope." Frank cupped her face in his hands, looking at his wife, his incredible, brave wife. "I would search for you through 1,000 storms for 1,000 days. I would never stop looking, never stop fighting to find you. You are my heart, Josephine Winters. Where you go, I go." She kissed him then, and in that kiss was a promise of love that would endure any hardship, weather any storm. They had already faced the worst that nature could throw at them, and they had survived. Together they could face anything. The winter passed gently after that harrowing December. Josephine regained her strength fully by February and was eager to return to teaching, though Frank was reluctant to let her go so soon. But he understood that her work was important to her, that the children needed her. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, married life suiting them both. Josephine would go to town during the week to teach, staying with the Colemans, and return to the ranch on weekends. It was not ideal, but it worked until the spring came, and the roads were easier to travel. In March, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled Frank with a joy so profound he could barely contain it. A child, their child, would be born before the year was out. Life was not just continuing after the nightmare of the blizzard. It was blooming, growing, becoming more beautiful than he had ever imagined. "Are you happy?" Josephine asked, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Frank replied, kissing her forehead. "I am blessed beyond measure. I have you, and now we will have a child. What more could any man want?" As her pregnancy progressed, Josephine had to give up teaching, much to the disappointment of her students, but she promised to return after the baby was old enough, and the school board agreed to hold her position. She spent those warm summer months at the ranch helping Frank however she could, though he insisted she rest and take care of herself. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, her hands busy with knitting tiny clothes, while Frank worked with the horses in the corral. Sometimes he would catch her watching him, a soft smile on her face, and his heart would swell with love. They talked often about the blizzard, about those 7 terrible days. Josephine confessed that she had nearly given up on the 6th day, had felt herself slipping away into sleep that she knew might be permanent. But then she had thought of Frank, imagined him searching for her, and she had forced herself to stay awake, to hold on for just one more day. "I knew you would come," she said. "Even when my body wanted to surrender, my heart knew you would not stop looking." Frank held her close, marveling at her strength. "You saved yourself as much as I saved you. You held on. You fought to survive. I just had to find you, but you had to stay alive. That was the harder part." In October, as the leaves turned brilliant shades of gold and red, Josephine went into labor. Doc Morrison came to the ranch, and Frank paced outside for hours, listening to Josephine's cries of pain and feeling utterly helpless. But when the doctor finally emerged with a smile on his face, Frank's world changed again. "You have a son," Doc Morrison announced. "A healthy baby boy. And your wife did beautifully. She is strong, that one." Frank rushed inside to find Josephine propped up in their bed, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Her face was pale and lined with exhaustion, but her smile was radiant. "Frank, come meet your son," she said softly. He approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at the small red face peeking out from the blankets. His son. His and Josephine's son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making small, snuffling sounds. "He is perfect," Frank whispered, reaching out to touch one tiny hand. The baby's fingers wrapped around his, gripping with surprising strength. "What should we name him?" Josephine looked thoughtful. "I was thinking Samuel, after the man who raised you and gave you your start in life. Samuel Winters." Frank's throat tightened with emotion. "That is perfect. Thank you." He carefully took the baby from Josephine's arms, cradling his son against his chest. Samuel opened his eyes, dark blue like all newborns, and seemed to look right at his father. In that moment, Frank felt the full weight of responsibility and love settle over him. He would protect this child and this woman with his life. He would build them a good life, a safe life, here on this ranch. The years that followed were full and rich. Samuel grew into a strong, curious boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. When he was 3, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, after Josephine's mother. 2 years after that came another son, James. Frank expanded the ranch, buying more land and cattle, building it into one of the most prosperous operations in the county. Josephine returned to teaching part-time when the children were old enough, starting a small school that met 3 days a week right there on the ranch for the children of the local homesteaders. Their home was always full of laughter and love and the chaos of raising 3 energetic children. Frank never took a single day for granted. Every morning when he woke up with Josephine in his arms, every evening when he came in from work to find his children playing in the yard, he remembered those 7 days of searching. He remembered the fear, the desperation, the certainty that he would never stop until he found her. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank and Josephine took a ride together, just the two of them, leaving the children with Tom and his wife. They rode out to the rocky area where Frank had found Josephine all those years ago. They stood in the small hollow, now just an unremarkable depression in the rocks. Nothing to show what had happened there. But both of them felt the weight of it, the significance. "I still have nightmares sometimes," Josephine admitted, holding Frank's hand. "I dream that I'm lost in the snow again, and no one is coming. But then I wake up and you are there, and I know I am safe." Frank pulled her into his arms. "You will always be safe. I will always be here. I searched for you once through a blizzard, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. I would search for you through anything, Josephine. You are my whole world." "And you are mine," she replied, tilting her face up to kiss him. "You saved my life that winter, Frank. But more than that, you gave me a life worth living. A beautiful, full life with you and our children. I could not imagine anything better." They stood there for a long time, holding each other, remembering the fear and pain, but also the incredible strength of love that had brought them through. The sun was warm on their faces, so different from that terrible week of cold and snow. As they rode back to the ranch, they could see their 3 children playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the wind. Samuel was 10 now, teaching his younger siblings how to throw a rope. Catherine was 7, her auburn hair so like her mother's catching the light. James was 5, already showing signs of being as stubborn as his father. Frank and Josephine reined in their horses for a moment, just watching their children, their home, the life they had built together. "We have come far," Josephine said softly. "We have," Frank agreed, "and we have so much further to go, growing old together, watching our children grow, maybe grandchildren someday." "Definitely grandchildren," Josephine said with a smile. "Many of them. This house is meant to be filled with family and love." As they rode into the yard, their children came running to meet them, all 3 talking at once about their day and the adventures they had. Frank dismounted and swung James up onto his shoulders while Josephine hugged Samuel and Catherine. That evening, after the children were in bed, Frank and Josephine sat on the porch in the rocking chairs he had built, watching the stars come out one by one. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that made up the fabric of their life together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that storm had never come?" Josephine asked. "If I had made it to the Hendricks place and back without incident?" Frank considered this. "I still would have proposed on Christmas Eve. We still would have gotten married and had our children. Maybe the timeline would have been different, but we would have ended up right here." "You think we were meant to be?" Josephine asked, a slight smile playing at her lips. "I know we were," Frank said firmly. "From the moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, my fate was sealed. The blizzard was terrible, and I would not wish that fear on anyone, but in a way it showed us both what we were willing to fight for. How much we loved each other, even before we said the words." Josephine reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "You were willing to die searching for me. And you were willing to survive alone in impossible conditions because you believed I would come. We both fought for this, for us. That is what makes it so strong." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the night air cool but pleasant. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Frank felt Josephine shiver slightly. He knew she was remembering those nights alone in the cold, hearing the wild animals around her while she huddled in her makeshift shelter. He pulled her chair closer to his and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You are safe," he murmured, "always safe with me." "I know," she whispered back, leaning into him. "I have always known." The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but always anchored by the deep love Frank and Josephine shared. Samuel grew into a fine young man who wanted to expand the ranch further west. Catherine developed her mother's love of teaching and books, dreaming of going to a real college back east. James was the wild one, always getting into trouble, but with such charm that it was hard to stay angry with him. When Samuel was 20, he married a sweet girl named Elizabeth from the next town over, and Frank and Josephine became grandparents for the first time when Elizabeth gave birth to twin daughters. Watching Josephine hold those babies, seeing the joy on her face, Frank was transported back to that first time she had held their own son. "We are getting old," Josephine said with a laugh. Though at 43 she was still beautiful, just with silver threading through her auburn hair now. "We are getting better," Frank corrected, "like good whiskey." Catherine did go east to college, much to her parents' pride and concern, but she returned home after graduation to start a proper school in Wyatt, one that would teach children through all grade levels. The town had grown substantially over the years, and her school became the heart of the community just as Josephine's teaching had been years before. James ended up surprising everyone by becoming a deputy sheriff, working alongside old Sheriff Coleman before the man finally retired. He had a gift for diffusing tense situations with his easy manner and quick wit, and he kept the peace in Wyatt admirably. Through it all, Frank and Josephine remained each other's anchor. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns and personal losses. When Josephine's former landlady from St. Louis died and left her a small inheritance, They used it to build a library in Wyatt, naming it after the woman who had helped Josephine make her way in the world. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a huge celebration. The entire town came, many people telling stories about how Frank and Josephine had helped them over the years, how Frank had extended credit when times were tough, how Josephine had taught their children not just reading and writing, but kindness and courage. But the story everyone wanted to hear again was the story of the blizzard, of how Frank had searched for 7 days and never given up, of how Josephine had survived through sheer will, of how their love had brought them through the impossible. "Tell it again," one of the younger children begged. "Tell about how grandfather found grandmother in the snow." Frank looked at Josephine, and she nodded with a smile. So he told the story, not glossing over the fear or the desperation, but emphasizing the hope that had kept him going, the love that had sustained them both. "The thing is," he finished, looking around at the crowd of friends and family, "when you love someone truly, giving up is not an option. You fight for them, you search for them, you hold on with everything you have. That is what love means. It means never stopping, never surrendering, always believing." Josephine stood and came to stand beside him, taking his hand. "And it means being worth fighting for. It means holding on even when letting go would be easier. It means trusting that the person who loves you will not abandon you, no matter how dark things seem." Their grandchildren listened with wide eyes, taking in the story that had become family legend. Frank knew that long after he and Josephine were gone, this story would be told and retold, a testament to the power of love and determination. As the celebration continued into the night, Frank and Josephine slipped away from the crowd, taking a quiet moment for themselves. They walked to the edge of the ranch property, where they could see the distant mountains that had nearly claimed Josephine's life all those years ago. 25 years, Josephine said wonderingly. "It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once." "I would do it all again," Frank said. "Every moment, every hardship, every joy, all of it has been worth it to be here with you now." Josephine turned to face him, her hands coming up to cup his face. There were lines around her eyes now, and her hair was more silver than auburn, but to Frank she was as beautiful as the day he first saw her. "I love you, Frank Winters," she said. "I have loved you for 25 years of marriage and months before that, and I will love you for however many years we have left." "Forever," Frank said. "We have forever. Maybe not in this life, but somewhere beyond, we will have forever together." They kissed under the stars, two people who had been through fire and ice together and come out stronger for it, two people who knew the true depth of commitment and the power of never giving up. As they walked back to the celebration hand in hand, Josephine suddenly laughed. "Do you remember how terrified you were when I went into labor with Samuel? Doc Morrison said you wore a path in the ground pacing back and forth?" Frank chuckled. "I was convinced something would go wrong. I had just gotten you back. I could not bear the thought of losing you again." "But you did not lose me. I am still here, stubborn as ever." "Thank God for that," Frank said fervently. The years continued to flow by like a river, steady and sure. Frank and Josephine watched their children build their own lives and families. They became great grandparents multiple times over. The ranch that Frank had built from almost nothing became a legacy, passed down to Samuel and eventually to his children. When Frank was 65, he had a bad fall from a horse and was laid up for several months. Josephine nursed him with the same dedication he had shown her after the blizzard, never leaving his side, making sure he followed doctor's orders even when he protested. "I am fine," he grumbled one day, trying to get out of bed against Josephine's orders. "You are not fine. You are stubborn," Josephine corrected, gently but firmly pushing him back down. "And I did not survive a week in a blizzard just to lose you to your own foolish pride. You will rest, and you will heal properly." Frank could not help but smile. "You are still as bossy as the day I married you." "Someone has to keep you in line," she retorted, but her eyes were soft with love. He healed, though slower than he liked, and eventually got back to running the ranch, albeit with more help from Samuel and his grandsons. Age was catching up with both of them, bringing aches and pains and limitations neither liked to acknowledge. But it also brought wisdom and perspective. Frank learned to delegate more, to trust that the ranch would continue without his constant oversight. Josephine finally fully retired from teaching, though she still tutored children who were struggling and donated books to Catherine's school regularly. They spent more time together, just the two of them, reliving old memories and making new ones. They took drives in the new automobile that James bought them, though Frank never fully trusted the contraption. They attended church every Sunday and had dinner with various children and grandchildren almost every day. On winter evenings they would sit by the fire, Josephine reading aloud while Frank listened, just as they had done when they were courting. Sometimes they would not talk at all, just sit in comfortable silence, holding hands, grateful for another day together. When Frank was 72 and Josephine 70, they took one last trip to the place where he had found her all those years ago. The journey was harder now, their bodies not as strong as they once were, but they were determined. They stood in the small hollow, and Josephine laid flowers there, a symbol of gratitude for survival and love. "I think about that young woman sometimes," Josephine said softly. "The 22-year-old girl who was so scared, so alone. I wish I could tell her that everything would work out more beautifully than she could imagine." "I think about that young man too," Frank replied. "The one who thought he would go mad with fear, who pushed himself past all limits because he could not give up. I wish I could tell him that the woman he was searching for would give him the most wonderful life imaginable." They held each other there, two people who had lived a full lifetime together, who had faced the worst and celebrated the best, whose love had never wavered for 50 years. "Thank you for finding me," Josephine whispered. "Thank you for surviving," Frank whispered back. "Thank you for holding on long enough for me to find you. Thank you for saying yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for every single day of these past 50 years. As they made their way slowly back to where their grandson waited with the automobile, Josephine stumbled slightly on the rocky ground. Frank caught her instantly, his arm steady around her waist. "I have got you," he said, the words automatic after all these years. "I know," Josephine replied, leaning into him. "You always do." They lived several more years, staying in the ranch house they had shared for so long, surrounded by family and love. Frank died peacefully in his sleep at 76 with Josephine holding his hand. His last words were her name, spoken with all the love and devotion of their 53 years together. Josephine followed him just 2 years later, at 72. In her final moments, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she smiled and said clearly, "Frank is here. He came for me. He never gave up." They were buried side by side in the Wyatt Cemetery under a large oak tree. Their headstone read simply, "Frank and Josephine Winters. He searched. She survived. Together, they built a life of love." But their story did not end there. It lived on in their descendants, in the ranch that still operated under the Winters name, in the library that still served the town, in the school where generations of children learned and grew. It lived on in the story that was told every winter when the snow began to fall, the story of how one man never gave up searching and one woman never stopped fighting to survive. And most importantly, it lived on as a testament to what love can accomplish when it refuses to surrender, when it persists through the darkest times, when it believes against all odds that hope is not lost. The legacy of Frank and Josephine Winters was not just in the property they left behind or the family they created. It was in the example they set, showing that true love means never giving up, always fighting, always believing. It means searching through 7 days of bitter cold because the alternative is unthinkable. It means holding on for one more day, one more hour, one more moment, because somewhere someone is looking for you and they will not stop until they find you. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on that ranch, still tell the story of the blizzard and the search and the love that conquered impossible odds. And every winter, when the snow falls heavy in Missouri, someone in the Winters family looks out at the white landscape and remembers that love is stronger than any storm, more enduring than any hardship, and more powerful than even death itself. Because Frank Winters searched for 7 days and never gave up. Because Josephine Anders survived a week in impossible conditions. Because when they finally found each other, they held on and never let go. That is the power of true love. And that is the legacy they left behind for all who came after them to witness and remember and aspire to in their own lives and loves.